What's up, everyone? Welcome to the 38th episode of Super Brain Radio, the third installment of Chapter 8, Plasticity, where we're talking about the actualized mechanisms behind learning. It's funny, learning, when I think about it, just sets off this huge cascade and lights up my brain, because it can be used to describe so many different things, ranging in the connotation spectrum of positive to negative to ambiguous. Sometimes learning is the only thing that matters, and sometimes it really doesn't matter at all. And all of these can be dipped into the pools, if you will, of sports, personal relationships, finances, accruing life experience that you actually want, and your memories associated with it. It's crazy how deep the concept of learning can go. And the things we're talking about today are going to highlight those mechanisms on what is behind the veil, if you will, of learning, and what does it mean to actually learn something on a mechanistic adaptational standpoint. The novel thing about this chapter is it's actually the only chapter of Super Brain Radio so far where it matters to not just listen to them in a chronological order, but to actually understand them to a degree. Previously, each episode's just kind of four friends hanging out under one roof, and they all have a mutual connection to each other, and the Protocols episode summates them nicely. This is truly like Lincoln Logs getting built and stacked, where the previous one is integral to the foundation of the subsequent, and so on and so forth. So this episode, I'm actually going to be talking about 4 types of functional neuroplasticity. So what I mean is the actual recruitment and refinement periods that are being specifically built for whatever stressor that we might talk about in a couple seconds, but these recruitment and refinement periods are no longer just general learning adaptations to LTP. It is now the actual growth, change, and in some cases specific compensatory atrophy to make things change upstairs. That's why I previously talked about, sure, our brain hypertrophies, but it's literally in picograms. Like, over time, it may not actually even be measurable unless you've done some drastic change to your brain. If you just lived like a sedentary life where there were minimal new experiences, opportunities to learn something, skills accrued, and trauma, it was just like somehow this gray linear transition towards death, you would actually have a brain that is a lot lighter in a lot of cases than someone who's maybe undergone trauma and learned major life new skills, or maybe someone who's learned several languages or lived and traveled slash travels, because we'll talk about maybe today actually a little bit of the oxytocin paradox when it's an acute or chronic basis. But whatever it is, all these types of skills that need cortical backing exist, and they adapt and mature in ways that are very eerily similar to the rest of the human body. Everything can adapt in a forward motion to get better. Now, remind ourselves, with great power comes great responsibility here. So, sure, we can do incredible things when I expose you guys to the functional neuroplastic avenues I'm about to, but it also reminds us that things can go very, very wrong if we turn a blind eye, if we choose to ignore things, and if we purposely embrace negative effects as a means of nobility or, self-depreciation or whatever it is, but it goes beyond just the acute moment. So, again, just really quick, we've talked about neuroplasticity as a means of change that happens in recruitment and refinement periods. And this is going beyond what has already been attained. So, in the same sense that when you go to the gym, you're actually mostly breaking down old muscle fibers that you've already developed. And the response to breaking down all of those old muscle fibers is going to cause a microgram change. Think about how small a microgram is change-wise, of new cellular actions, actual nuclei. Maybe it's an increase in myosin heavy change, micrograms of new cellular change is what it is. Not even being specific, like, oh, we will have micrograms of nucleation only. No, this is micrograms of just change, period, is going to happen in response. So now when we extrapolate that over to upstairs in the brain, it's not only is it going to be smaller, it is going to be a similar concept where the neuroplastic portion and avenue is actual new change that is pioneered, never before seen by your organism. Anything that is with quote unquote old stuff is not going to be neuroplastic. And that's a vast and important difference. The same way it's an important difference to understand that with strength and sports performance training. Now, the neuroplastic avenues are more complex, as I warned you. The eerie simplicity of general learning adaptation syndrome is what makes this more complex. So I'm going to attempt to start with the two that I believe are easier to wrap our heads around and go from there. First, we have map expansion. Now, imagine a recruitment period gone wild, in a positive way, I guess. Or maybe I'm just an optimist, because it could certainly be negative. But map expansion means a certain neuroplastic coordination of neurons, meaning when all these boys get aroused together, they are going to bleed into other areas and typically enlargen is the mode that it goes down. And that's why I said it's like a recruitment period gone wild. Map expansion also means that it can include maybe new senses, it can include adjacent cortical areas, and we can then have crossing, which is when a smell on a very much more understandable scale, a smell can elicit a memory. But now maybe we have it with your motor cortex and your amygdala, and maybe a certain song helps ignite a specific motor pattern. And there's a lot of other definitions and examples we can go through with map expansion. But be aware of the fact that something can get red hot enough that it can continue to grow. We have homologous area adaptation, and these are obviously very specific terms, but the good part about these terms is they're providing us really key insight into what is going on. Now, imagine a refinement period gone wild. Homologous area adaptation has to do with specifically altering the structural and functional aspects of the associated neurons in homologous areas, as it states, so meaning same like one, and it is going to cause vast changes in the actual blood metabolism. So blood metabolism in any cortical region is how we define its activity, its nourishment, its capacity, if you will, and its resting state being higher means it's more active. So homologous area adaptation, like I said, these structural functional changes that are going to alter blood flow and metabolism, these things that have to do with this area has now adapted differently than its adjacent friends specifically. Now, the last two are the coolest aspects of the human body and the brain, and can be difficult to understand at times. When we talk about cross-modal reassignment, meaning like distance, we actually should revisit the analogies I've spoken about when it comes to the endocrine system and hormones. Even the spinal cord communicating with muscles. Excuse me. When we have distant communication, we need analogs to do so. Analogs are protein typically based ligands, non-dietary amino acids that can be used for communication. Cross-modal reassignment has to do with perhaps there was damage or drastic trauma, or I guess drastic success, that was impeding on a similarly but distant part of the brain's area's function. What can happen here is one job from over here can now be uptaken by somebody over there. You just moved from the 4th floor to the 12th floor, perhaps, and although you're in the same building, you're quite distant and doing a different job with different responsibilities. So the reason I brought up trauma and success, meaning And let's maybe view this in a sports performance realm and keep it within the motor cortex, something a little more, close to home for us all. We can talk about how maybe at first you were using your hamstrings to do some type of vertical toss, like throwing a med ball just as high as humanly possible. But eventually you start to recognize that with more knee flexion, with more feet, and different angles of hip flexion, you can actually produce far more force. So eventually, the job of the hamstrings being the main force producers in your hip hinge bent over vertical toss is now being reassigned to the knee flexors and the adductors. Lastly, we have compensatory masquerade. And compensatory masquerade is as cool as it sounds and even more important. It goes to show the plight that our entire brain has for keeping something important in line. We learned about compensatory masquerade with actually rhesus monkeys and having limbs chopped off, ethically, quote unquote, but it was valuable to a degree. And what we learned was, even if a limb has been severed, you will make similar adaptations to the limb that's been severed neurologically, and more important, you will make greater adaptations on the other. And you might say, okay, well, that makes sense. You only have one arm now, so that one arm has to do everything. What we continue to learn is that first, that severed arm's neurons will attempt to do whatever they can to stay alive and keep their jobs. But eventually, they will be reassigned in a different type of manner. They're more specifically being constructed to do something different. So now they're going to contribute to maybe your right arm was severed. Now, instead of having just a left arm and a right arm neuron, and maybe even the right arm neuron dying, these right arm neurons are now moving towards the left to increase the function and actual opportunity to be used by the left. Now, this is vastly different than what we just previously talked about with excuse me, I was so on to compensatory masquerade, cross-modal reassignment. When we talk about what's the difference here, not only is it the distance, it's the fact that it's a reassignment going on, where here we have an addition of troops. We have new employees that have been added to our workforce. And this is typically done because of a bad thing, like an arm being severed. Compensatory masquerade is compensatory, and masquerade meaning to mask and to alter and to deal with. It makes a lot of sense. I love the way the neuroplastic scientists and researchers name these things, because as you all know, biology is not always named logically, but these are the actual avenues we're going to traverse and learn. And in the final episode, I'm going to tie it together with some stories and, more importantly, some actual from point A to point B scenarios on how and why this is appropriate, makes sense, and is an integral part of your plight to be your best.